Buck Rogers versus Flash Gordon. So I was asking Michelle, okay, well, I don't really know, like, I'm not well read on Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. Did they have, like, their own sort of bat belts, and whose bat belt was better, you know? And she's like, oh, I wasn't thinking of it necessarily in a fight, but if I'm going to think that way, and then she started coming up with all sorts of stuff. But then Eitan said, well, Flash, you know, and he had this and he had that, and he was talking more, you know, why Flash might be cooler or Buck might be cooler. And so I guess this really is a wide open panel, and I'm going to leave it that way. Buck Rogers versus Flash Gordon panel, have at it.
Well, first of all, they're both ordinary people that are gadgeted up the wazoo. It's all the gadgets when it comes to Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. Absolutely. In terms of who was the better pulp, I would have to go with Flash Gordon, simply because it's all about the villain, baby. It's all about the villain, and there is no better pulp villain in my mind than Ming the Merciless. He was just freaking perfect.
And Flash could never actually kill Ming because he had a love affair with Princess Aurora.
I don't know.
And you can't love someone and kill their father. It just never works in stories.
I'm just coming from outside, and again, this is just outside. I love the idea, and gee, I wonder why, of somebody falling asleep in one century and waking up many centuries later to try to fix the world. That as an idea, seems to work great for me. What about you, Eitan?
It's an interesting idea, but Buck Rogers never had a central bad guy. I mean, there was a lot about Buck Rogers. Between the two of them, I prefer Buck Rogers because Buck Rogers was one of the first things that I ever really seriously read from the pulp era. I just got that big book from the 70s, which all the Buck Rogers comic strips, I devoured it. So in terms of personal knowledge, I'm all about Buck Rogers. But if you're just going to go with it, Flash Gordon has Ming, and that makes him the better pulp. If I'm wrong, let me know how.
Well, I think that, well, one was the actual history of Buck Rogers, who was originally called Anthony Rogers, in a story, and I think it was an Astounding Science, or excuse me, Amazing Stories in 1928, was a character, and then he assumed the name of Buck Rogers when he started coming into the comics a few years later, and I mean, the whole thing of the stories and what they're doing in that pulp, bigger than life. I think that's the main thing about both those guys is that they're bigger than life. Anybody reading them, then it gives them something they can actually, maybe you could say aspire to, but it was, you know, someone that stood for good or wanted to vanquish evil, became like a real good, you know, the black and white that was going on back then, and just whatever you stood for in terms of that white hat was what these guys represented, and bringing forth their sense of integrity. What they're doing was, at least to me, when I used to read them, that's what I got out of it. It's just a real simple type thing, like overcoming the obstacles. I didn't really see them as this or this one. They're two different storylines that went out. But I enjoy them because again, when I read those things, yeah, you have to suspend all forms of belief. But it was just, at that point, it was just a story. What was happening? What were they going to do? You knew they're going to find somebody they're going to have to battle, and of course they're going to win at the end. But how many times they get beat up? How many times they get cut? Maybe sliced or something. But of course they're going to win. But how did that accomplish?
Well, the thing I actually liked about Buck Rogers more than Flash Gordon was Buck Rogers' love interest was a soldier too. Wilma was actually also, for the 1930s, I was actually pretty dang progressive. She was a soldier. She was a flyer. She had her own gun. She got into her own combat. The love interests for Flash were just, you know, what was it? The
Flash
secretary and the princess. So that was kind of fairly standard there. So there were things about
Dale dated back to when he was a polo player before the meteors landed on Earth.
Oh, and to answer your question, if it came down to a fight between them, I think Buck Rogers would kick Flash Gordon's butt. Because one guy was a polo player and the other guy was a combat veteran from World War I.
I thought Buck Rogers was an astronaut.
Oh, no, you're talking about the 1970s. I'm going back to the pulp.
Oh.
Like, he was a World War I veteran who got caught in a mine shaft. It collapsed.
Smelled some gas and passed out. Woke up a few hundred years later.
Woke up a few hundred years later.
Okay.
Or however many.
And the other guy was alternately a polo player, sports star.
Did he ever make references in his stories to his past, bringing them into the future? In My Day We Used To. Was there ever that? Or that was simply the backstory? And
that was the backstory.
Forward? Got it. Okay, so let's take the vote down the line. Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon? We'll start...
If you're talking just personal combat, Buck Rogers. If you're talking the better pulp, Flash Gordon.
Well, that's a nice political answer there. You're elected. John, and he can't commit because, you know,
He is not going
I
to
already
commit.
know he's not committing, and he's got the 2 storylines idea. Am I correct in that, John?
You 100%.
All right, Michelle.
I would have to go with Flash Gordon because I did not read the original pulps. The Buck Rogers I know was an astronaut who got frozen in space. So, but in a person, I agree. I guess in a personal fight, Buck Rogers probably would win, but Flash Gordon had all the nifty gadgets, and I really liked Princess Aurora.
Well, I'm going with Buck Rogers. I like his backstory. I like his combat vet experience, and I didn't know that about Wilma. That's that ups him a little bit in my book. So I'm going with Buck. Well, that wraps up our special episode of Never
wait a
Ending
minute.
Panel. Oh wait, that doesn't wrap up. And
I
to Soundman Tim.
was just going to say that I think that the 70s Buck Rogers would beat the 80s Flash Gordon.
Yes, definitely.
Interesting.
Very good. And I apologize for completely forgetting that side of the room because I'm used to your line of sight right down there, and it's weird I couldn't.
But pretty much what I'm going to say is,
Yeah.
any decade, any era, Ming was always cool.
Well,
Seconded.
Don't ever discount a really good bad guy.
Oh, Max von Sydow, wonderful Ming. I mean,
And that wraps up this very special episode.